Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the JFK Junior Forum. My name is John Della Volpe. I will be the moderator this evening. And before we start, I want to introduce our panel of pollsters. For those of you who I haven't met, I'm the polling director here at the Institute of Politics, focused mostly on the youth vote. Several of our students from the Harvard Public Opinion Project are in attendance tonight, so thank you for coming. And we'll moderate tonight, and we'll make it as interactive as possible. Before I start, I want to introduce to my immediate left, Tony Fabrizio. Tony is a partner in the firm Fabrizio, Lee & Associates. He is widely recognized as an expert in public opinion and politics and one of the nation's leading GOP pollsters and strategists. Tony has served as a chief pollster on 4 presidential campaigns, most notably and recently Donald Trump's successful 2006 campaign for president and his upset victory. Over the years, Tony has helped more than 24 U.S. senators, more than 50 members of Congress, numerous governors, and other statewide elected officials, as well as dozens of issue groups and trade associations. Among his many clients include Senator Rand Paul, Governor Bevin from Kentucky, Governor Scott of Florida, Senate Majority Mitch McConnell, and Senator Bill Cassidy of Louisiana. To Tony's left is Margie Omero. You likely know Margie as the co-host and co-founder of the Pollsters podcast, the top 200 podcast. I'm sure everyone has it on their device and listens regularly. Thanks for coming, Margie. Margie is also, as of today, announced a partner in the Democratic polling firm of GBA Strategies. She has over 20 years of experience in both quantitative and qualitative research, and her clients included some of the world's largest brands, including Facebook, and many nonprofit advocacy groups, such as the Democratic National Committee, Emily's List, the Center for American Progress, Every Town for Gun Safety, and hundreds of Democratic candidates for office. Margie has also led the bipartisan team studying Walmart moms, a proven swing voter bloc covered by nearly every major news outlet for the better part of the last decade. To her left is Mark Penn, and I think probably the reason that I'm here, back in 1991, 1992, when I was a very, very young man, Mark was kind enough to offer me a job as an analyst at his polling company, Penn and Schoen. And that was about 25 years ago, but Mark has been in the business for 40 years. I would argue that perhaps he started his career on this campus as a student and a member of the Crimson team. But his career spans market research, advertising, public relations, polling, and consulting. Began on this campus, as I said. He's advised top world leaders. He's led companies and written a best-selling book. His next book is in the works. It will be hit the stores in sometime to early 2018.
March 20th.
March 20th. March 20th. A follow-up to Micro Trends, his very popular book from a decade ago. Mark is a founder, president, and managing partner of the Stagwell Group, which is a private equity firm and fund that invests in marketing services companies, and this year became the chairman of the Harris Poll. He's a globally recognized strategist. He's advised companies in corporate affairs, political leaders, both in the U.S. and internationally. For 6 years, he served as a White House pollster for President Bill Clinton and was a key advisor in his 1996 re-election campaign. He later served as chief strategist to Hillary Clinton in her Senate campaigns and her 2008 presidential campaign. Internationally, Mark has worked for more than 25 leaders in Asia, Latin America, and Europe, including Tony Blair and Manhattan Begin. Please join me in welcoming Tony, Margie, and Mark. If I could, I'd like to start with the same question for the 3 panelists, and start, Tony, with you. And the way in which I kind of reflect on polling and the coverage in the media, I think oftentimes we hear too much about numbers and not enough about people. So what I would like to do is to start, if you could help tell the story of the American voter, each of you, by the group that you know best. And Tony, I don't think there's anyone today who knows more about the Republican voter, and feel free to talk about the party or the different segments that make up today's Republican Party.
Thank you. Thank you, John. Thank you all for having us here tonight. The last time Mark and I were here was 20 years ago when he roundly beat my brains in when I worked for Bob Dole and he worked for Bill Clinton. So it's a little bit better. I feel a little bit better about being here tonight, obviously. Talk a little bit about the Republican Party. And I used to use the example of Barry Goldwater. In 1964, Barry Goldwater was considered to be at the absolute fringe of the Republican Party. In fact, if he moved one more step to the right, he'd fall off the face of the earth. 20 years later, Barry Goldwater was at best considered a moderate Republican, and in 30 years, Barry Goldwater was considered at best a liberal Republican. Many of you don't know who Barry Goldwater is, and if you did, it's just a name that you've heard. But let me use a name that you definitely have heard, and someone that was in the news a lot last year, and that is a guy named Jeb Bush. 12 years ago, Jeb Bush was regarded as the god of conservatism in terms of state governance. Governors, local politicians, state legislators from all over the country wanted just to peek under the hood of how his conservative policy machine in Florida changed everything from education to taxes to regulatory reform on a whole host of issues. Well, just last year, that conservative Solon ran for president, had the most money, had 100% name ID. And guess what? Jeb Bush was at best regarded as a moderate Republican. Most thought he was left of center as a Republican. Did Jeb Bush change, or did the Republican Party change? The Republican Party changed. And the issues they were concerned about changed. And the level of which they paid attention to politicians and what politicians did changed. We were talking about this a little while ago. And the Republican Party today, and one of the things that we noticed in 2010, 2012, and 2014, and I have to tell you, the 2012 election between Romney and Obama was an aberration in that people thought after the wave in 2010 that the voters had been sated, or that, you know, the conservative movement had been sated. Or the Tea Party movement had been sated, whatever you want to call them. The 2000 election just glossed over it, because coming back in 2014, it came back with a vengeance. And what happened is that the people who were motivated in 2010 were again motivated in 2014. This time they were more angry. And the first time when they elected Republicans to Congress, they said, well, if only we had the Senate, we can do more. In 2014 comes along, we have the Senate and the House. Well, only if we had the White House, we could do more. And what's happened is the Tea Party groups and the conservative groups and even the rank and file Republicans, traditional establishment Republicans, had grown very frustrated. In fact, one of the questions we asked consistently through the primary period was, how would you describe your feelings towards the federal government? Would you say you're angry, you're frustrated, you're happy, on a scale? And we would get a third or more of Republicans that would say they were outright angry. In fact, the number of that who said they were angry and frustrated was over 80%, sometimes 90%, depending on the state and the group. And so you had a group of voters that, while they were disparate, the Tea Party Republicans were different than the establishment Republicans, in that the Tea Party Republicans were very hardcore on immigration and spending and taxes, whereas the establishment Republicans were less hardcore on immigration, more likely to accept the path to citizenship, and when it came to spending and taxes, more likely to be deficit hawks than supply-siders, which were more likely to be the Tea Party folks. Yet, there's one thing that brought them together: their frustration with what was going on in Washington. Both the lack of things occurring and the hangover of the Obama years, which to them, President Obama became the symbol of everything that was wrong with Washington and America. And so along comes a gentleman by the name of Donald J. Trump. You have several different factions of the Republican Party out there, all of them equally angry, all of them wanting to drain the swamp, which wasn't a thing then, but they wanted to change Washington. And here you had a guy who despite his lack of political experience, they were willing to embrace because he had one thing no other candidate did, and that was their belief that he was willing to speak truth to power when it came time to changing the way Washington worked. And in fact, they believed, no matter what stripe of Republican you were, they believed that Washington was set up by the politicians and the special interest for them, not for the average folk. And he touched that chord. And he actually spoke in ways that politicians had never spoken before. A lot of Republicans gritted their teeth. A lot of Republicans rolled their eyes. But every time he doubled down, we would see it in focus groups. People would say, consistently, like a chorus, well, I don't agree with what he said, but the fact that he's got the guts to repeat it when the media is beating him up tells me that he's going to stand by his guns when he's there in Washington. That's what they wanted. They wanted somebody who was going to stand by their guns, who was going to be an outsider and not part of it. Now what we see inside the Republican Party, the topology is changing. And what's happened is now we're watching that there are 4, maybe 5 different groups inside the Republican Party, one of which I call the Trump Republicans. The Trump Republicans are about 20 to 25% of the party, depending on the state. That group of Republicans, his job approval rating is 97-1. 97-1. Then you got the Tea Party Republicans. They're still there. They haven't gone anywhere. Their number has declined because some of them went over and became Trump Republicans, but they're about 15% of the party. And among them, the president's job approval rating is in the high 80s, almost 90. Those two groups together are about 40% of the party, and that is the basis of his intense strength inside the party. The other two groups, the establishment or the traditional Republicans, are about 40% of the party. They like him. Well, his job approval numbers are about 20 points lower than they are with the other groups. He still has a net job approval. But what they do is they hate Republicans in Congress. They like President Trump. So their choice is, who do I side with? The guys that I think that I hate, because I don't think they're doing a good job, or him. And the other group that we've identified, and we're still looking at different groups, is the Libertarian Republicans. Now, you all think of libertarians, you think of free market economics and limited government, almost anarchy, right? The truth of the matter is libertarianism inside the Republican Party has become the bastion of liberal Republicans. It is the Republicans who, it has little to do with foreign policy, it has everything to do with social and moral policy, and they are still in the Republican Party because they believe in free market economics, but they want a socially tolerant, actually more than socially tolerant, they want a progressive social and moral policy inside the party. And so those 4 groups right there, and then you've got another chunk of Republicans that kind of refuse to be identified. They're not refused, but they kind of slip between the groups depending on what's going on. But as long as he holds on to that 40% for the time being, it's going to be very hard to collapse him. His worst group are the Libertarian Republicans. Now, that makes no sense considering people argue that the president doesn't have an ideological core. So that group should be the most to like him. But the fact of the matter is what we've seen consistently is Republicans place themselves to the right of the president ideologically where they place him. And his biggest support group are the most conservative Republicans. If you look at self-described conservatives who are frequent church attenders and born-again evangelical Christians, one of his top support groups. And it has nothing to do with his social and moral policy. It has everything to do with them being angry with Washington, and I will agree, judges have something certainly to do with that. So the Republican Party the topology is changing, and he is molding it. The question becomes, does the Trump Republican group continue to grow, or do the other two parts stay apart from it? Can he attract more? Because to protect himself, he needs to have a larger group out of those factions, if you will, or tribes within the party.
Thanks, Tony. Margie, you can talk, I know, about multiple segments within the Republican Democratic Party, but it would be a shame if we didn't hear your perspective on the Walmart mom vote. But could you first explain who the Walmart mom is, how she may have evolved the last decade or so, and what role you think she'll play in the future?
So let me back up a little bit and talk about the importance of qualitative and really listening to voters, because I know there are a lot of folks here who are studying polling, who want to go into polling, who are working on polling projects in some way. And when I was young, when I was a college student, there was not, which was, kind of a long time ago, not like decades ago, but kind of a long time ago. There was not, people didn't know what pollsters were. You didn't have, not every candidate even knew why they needed a pollster. They thought they could just go to the grocery store or to the locker room, which had a different meaning then. And find out what was happening. You didn't have people in planes asking you about response rates and cell phone, how you handle cell phones and shy Trump voters. I mean, this was not, you didn't have like 1,000 different outlets covering polls. You didn't have political data analytics conferences as like an offshoot of polling. It was simply not quite as pervasive as industry. So I think we've built on some of those tools, and also at the same time maintaining an interest in really speaking to real people and using qualitative. That you cannot replace with all of the data that folks now pay a lot of attention to. Whether or not someone's up 0.1 or 0.2, or is the projection 60% or 25%. Those calculations are all very important. That work is incredibly important. But qualitative work and figuring out how to write questions, being able to write and listen, are skills that are as important as the number crunching that goes into polling. And when we've done focus groups, and the Walmart Moms Project is mostly qualitative, although we've done some quantitative, is go and talk to swing voting moms around the country in hot battleground areas and live stream them completely unedited, unvarnished, to political reporters in Washington. And the value of that is, instead of folks just sort of bouncing around on Twitter, what the latest approval rating is and, all of that, you can really hear how people process your question. It's not simply about what they remember or what they say or whether they think, someone's 5 points higher than the other on some dimension. It's also what they don't know. It's also the misinformation that they have. And you can't really get all that as easily in a quantitative instrument. It's really something that you can hear out of qualitative. And lack of interest, lack of awareness is a finding. It's not a sign that your focus group's not going well, or the moderator's not doing their job, or the respondents aren't right. That's a finding. If they come in and they say, which is what we found, and I'm sure other folks up here have seen the same thing, where there's been a race where there's been tens of millions or hundreds of millions of, ads run in that state or in that market. And they come into the room and they're like, I think I heard something about how she met with Obama once. Like, they have, the information is very thin, and that tells you, that's an important finding. That means that, folks slave away over what one line or one image or one press story is going to contain, when folks are really just getting a little bit, as it just sort of moves past them like a cloud, and they move on to something else in their day, because it's not their job to really, pay excruciating attention to the campaign messaging. And that's not something to look at voters and look down on them because they're not reading Politico or reading Axios or what have you. It's just something to work around. It's to acknowledge. It's because they rely on Washington and on their elected leaders to do the right thing without folks having to pay attention so closely to make sure they are doing the right thing. Now, that's changed recently, and we saw it in the Walmart mom groups, and you see it in quantitative data done nationally, where people are paying more attention at the same time that they're not really very excited about what they're watching. So you've seen those two things go up at the same time. When we talk to Walmart moms, and I don't want to single out moms per se or make generalizations about moms. I don't mean at all to say that moms are monolithic or that once you have kids you immediately think X, because I don't think that's true, and I think that's such an oversimplification. You do though see a lot of moms use language of if they walked a mile in my shoes, if they understood all the things I have to juggle in my day-to-day life, then these politicians would understand how hard it is. They would not have all these partisan fights. They wouldn't try to score political points. They'd try to really get something done and accomplish something. You hear them use the language of their family and making the trains run on time as a lens through which they view how badly Washington is doing. And they even use some colorful examples that I think magnify that, where, you know, they would talk about all the things they have to do in their daily life, and then they say, okay, well, what do you think your member of Congress's life is like? And they said, well, they have breakfast, lunch, and dinner served to them by their private chef. Now, that's not true, right? If you go to Congress and like, welcome, here's orientation, and here's your private chef that's going to make breakfast, lunch, and dinner for you. You can eat easily, but it's not, it's not comes with the job. But it's a symbol of they don't even have to feed themselves. I have to feed all these people in my household. They have food just fly out of the sky. So that's how they imagine it. And if you talk about gas prices, they said, well, what do they know? They don't even have to pump their own gas, let alone drive themselves. They don't, they have no idea what's going on if they're just sitting in the car. And so these examples are not based on an article they read about the lifestyles of members of Congress. It's just how they perceive the different divide. And it's something that is not, I appreciate Tony's perspective, and I'm sure it's true that Republicans are more, upset about that. But it's not something that is particularly partisan. There are folks on all sides who feel like Washington is so out of touch. They go there, they lose touch. They don't know what it's like to be me. And they don't know what it's like to have the worries about what your kids are doing and bullying and, day-to-day life and making sure, we've had focus groups where people said, my refrigerator broke, I lost my job, I'm getting divorced, I'm living with my parents, I'm really glad I'm in this room tonight because this is like the best break that they had that week. And those kinds of things you can't get in quantitative. And it's important to remember that ultimately a lot of this political work, while it's fun to kind of see who's been zinging who in Washington, ultimately it's about making sure people's lives are better. And a lot of times for a lot of voters, and this is, it's gotten worse, it's always been true, they don't feel that anybody's really trying to make their daily life better.
Margie, one of the, I was saying this to Tony earlier, one of the most remarkable moments in my career was I kind of feel like I stumbled upon a focus group of men. And when people ask you on the airplane that you're a pollster, they ask me, well, did you predict the election, right? Did you predict Trump? I said no, but about a year before that, I think I had an indication that he would do well is because of this group of men. And it's worth kind of just sharing their story, which is these were men about my age. They had kids in high school or about to go into college, and they felt like they had done everything in their entire lives they were supposed to do, right? They married their high school sweetheart. A few of them, I think, served in Desert Storm. They woke up in their 40s and close to 50, where they were literally having to sell the possessions in their home to pay the mortgage, right? There were no more hours to work at the UPS outlet or flying planes for FedEx or any other kind of small, all the other kind of jobs and small businesses there. And they felt like the one thing they never paid attention to was Washington, right? They told me they voted for Bill Clinton in the 90s, then for George Bush, then Obama, the swing voters. And now that's the one regret that they had. They worked as hard as they possibly could, but they just don't have kind of enough just to even pay the mortgage the next month. They were selling their motorcycles and their televisions and whatever it was just to keep a roof over their head. And that is, I think, is kind of the underlying factor of the beginning, perhaps, Tony, of your campaign back in 2015, 2016. Mark, we can talk about swing voters, you can talk about Democrats, but paint the picture for us in terms of the voters that you see that we need to pay more attention to.
Well, I think you've given me an interesting challenge, which is to give 5 minutes without numbers, when basically I'm on the other side of the qualitative argument with Margie. At least when it comes to politics, actually, one of the first things I did in the Clinton campaign was to ban all focus groups. Because why did I do that? Because they were coming back with conclusions that seemed pretty much at odds with the quantitative data. And then I would say, well, look, a typical political group is 4 people on one side, 4 people on the other side, and 2 people who said nothing. And then the thing was that the 2 people who said nothing who were the only people who counted. And so that I felt that it was very difficult from the quantitative or Qualitative rather, to really zero in on the swing voter group, because when you do 1,000 interviews, then you really have a group of 200, 300, or 400 to analyze. So I would say in non-political, I'm a bigger fan of Qualitative. In political, I think it has to be balanced with what I certainly would call artful polling. I think that I would say that if I were just going to try to do this without numbers, I would say, look, just imagine there's one house, and in that house would be the African American leadership, Latino leadership, let's put the progressives, let's put a lot of the youth vote, and let's put a fair representation of the working class. Let's put them over there. And then have another house where you have basically Christian evangelicals, you've got basically small government conservatives, which I'll kind of give to Tony. I'll say there's one group with guns and there's one group without guns, right? And there's a big difference between whether or not they have guns or not. We'll give them a diminishing number of suburban voters. They used to be, I think, even stronger in the suburbs, but I think we picked a lot off with soccer moms who've been coming more over to the Democratic column, and we'll give them all pro-business. And I always say, when you make a small business person, you make a Republican. So whatever we'd fund these programs to make more small business, I want you to understand that was there's about 9. That's almost a number. I was going to tell you the percentage, but no, I want to see if I can get through this. So now, if you have these two houses, then the election is pretty much about either people who were not in one of these two houses, right, new voters who are going to parachute in one way or the other, and about whether or not you can get people to walk over from one house to the other. And I think history in the last, let's call it 50 years, probably has shown that there were two groups who've been able to walk over one side to the other. I would say soccer moms, which I developed the concepts behind in '96, is one group where I think Democrats brought them in the House. I think they were more Republican than they are now. I think the Democratic Party showed that they had the kinds of values that was consistent with the new work experiences and child rearing experiences that these voters were having, and I think we were successful. And I think the second group is pretty much a working class group that we've seen go back and forth, and that the Democrats sort of said, hey, don't worry, we, when I moved the target from Macomb County voters to soccer moms, it's because at that point we didn't have to worry about the Macomb County voters. And I think what happened here is that people really didn't kind of fully temperature check whether those people were ready to walk over to the other house. And I think a fair number of working class voters who had just voted for Obama walked over to the other house in response to a fairly independent appeal of Trump. And then I'd say the non-voters, I think the youth vote is considered very strong for Democrats. There was a book I read here, Rebellion in the University, when I was here that taught me, which is so interesting, that don't worry, young people always have these views and then they change it. Because as I say, if you look at the electorate, old people are so Republican and so grumpy at this point, but they were all Kennedy voters. They were all Democrats once. And that they really did go exactly through the transformation that's in Rebellion in the University. And remember, there are about 90 million couch potato voters. There are about 90 million people who are eligible to vote but don't vote. And that group is a very downscale group. So when you look at the kind of returns we have, who's going to come in? Well, I think we've had a tremendous surge in African American vote. We've had a huge surge in Latino vote. It was 2% in '96. It's now 10% or more. We've had huge growth in those votes. Right now, Asians are probably the fastest growing. Asian Americans are one of the fastest growing new ethnic groups, I would say. And they were Republican, and they switched over to the Democratic side. And there are a lot of downscale voters who are not registered, who are in working class areas, who are actually probably 50 or 60 million of those sitting out there. Because if you went to college, almost all of you people who go to college wind up voting. And it's very interesting to look at. So with that, I hope I've kind of given you a less numerical, more description, who's in the house, who's leaving, who do we have to worry about, is a lot about. And then when you look at these two houses and you look at the coalitions in them, boy, you really kind of understand why it's very difficult for people in each of those houses to live in the same neighborhood.
Thanks, Mark. Can I follow up on Mark's metaphor of the houses? And Tony, in a practical way, right? Campaigns, especially kind of where you start, was always, I think, about kind of expanding the franchise, expanding the base, and using Mark's metaphor is who are the first people likely to leave the house, right? And who are the folks you can get to kind of attract, or at least come outside and have a conversation with, right? So can you tell us a little bit about what the process is to how I identify those voters, and then messaging?
We found in our research that one of the questions that we asked all the way through in our surveys was whether or not you wanted a president who would change and take the country in a new direction, or whether or not you wanted a president who would basically continue another 4 years of Obama's policy. We took it out of the Clinton and Trump context, if you will. And what we found was, depending on the state, we would get anywhere between 55 and 58% in the target states that said new direction, and we'd get about 35 to 40% that said stay the course, basically. And when we looked at those voters, the 58%, if you will, we found that even though you would think that they would be natural targets, because obviously Clinton could never be a change candidate, right? We found that there were a group of hardcore Democrats and Obama supporters that were saying change, or excuse me, Sanders supporters that were saying change because they didn't think Obama was liberal enough, we found in our quantitative research. So we had to take them out. And when we boiled it all down, we came up with a group of anywhere between 7 and 12% of voters in each of the target states that were our primary targets. They wanted change. They weren't hardcore Democrats. But they said that they wouldn't consider either Clinton or Trump. Okay, so that was a challenge. They wouldn't consider voting for either of them. They either said they were not voting for president but voting, or voting for one of the third-party candidates, or undecided. So it was a huge challenge. And one of the things that we found in both of those instances, the objection to getting them for Trump was his temperament. The objection for getting them for Clinton was perceived ethics. And so what we started doing was pitting those two things together. For which voters in this group was temperament less important than ethics, and which voters was ethics more important than temperament? And that helped us narrow down even further the targets that we needed to go after and model after, because we couldn't win on temperament to someone that temperament was important, and she couldn't win for someone who said ethics was more important. So that ultimately became, when you got down to the very nitty-gritty, that's why in the last couple of weeks of the campaign, you saw him focusing on draining the swamp, and her and the ethics, and the Comey thing played right into it.
So I think that's interesting, and it also is part of this larger question, is what drives voters? Is it the personality or the specifics of the candidates? Is it the issues of the two parties? Is it some kind of tonal thing, some sort of third piece? I mean, I would wonder what your analysis would look like now, just talking about the parties alone, taking Trump out of the equation. Pew just released their political typology report. I don't know if folks saw it in the last week or two. It was super interesting, and they have 4 groups of Republicans, 4 groups of Democrats. 2 of the Democrat groups for the first time are majority-minority. That's new. And they look at the different issues that divide them, although that's separate than being vote drivers. The fact that you can find an issue that lends itself to segmentation doesn't mean that that's actually what brings people out to vote for a Democratic candidate for Congress or a Republican candidate for Congress. But one thing that was interesting with the Republican side, and so on the Democratic side, you had one of the big issues that differentiated was the role of faith, where the minority groups were more placed a heavier emphasis on that than the solid liberal group, which was overwhelmingly white, upscale, super liberal, and predominantly female, sort of like women's marcher folks, I guess you could call them, for a shorthand. On the Republican side, the issue that was particularly important was whether or not they felt the economic system is typically fair for most people, which is kind of like what you're talking about in terms of change. It is a big, like a 70-point gap between two of the groups and two of the other groups, which is, on a scale of 0 to 100, is pretty massive, and is going to be, it is part of the divide on the right as we talk about tax reform, or where the Republican Party goes next, or which party is seen as part of the elite and which party is not, and that's a thread that underlines all of that. So we'll see how that sort of thing plays out. But that's separate from temperament. That's separate from ethics. That is, how people view the parties and what they think of as important.
Yeah, look, let me just give you a slightly different model. Now my no numbers rule is off, so I'm going to hit you with a few. But I do think, we've been teaching this polling course in the government department for 4 years. I do think, which I want to encourage anyone who's here, we're not giving it this year because we're doing the book, but we'll be giving it next fall. And the goal of that really is pretty much to explain how presidents use polls in their decision making, but really to say, look, a good poll or pollster is not 36% believe this and 42% believe that. It's to understand the numbers in a way that you have a model. So if people had asked me about what was going on in the 2016 election, I said, well, look, this is actually a very unique constellation here. I'd say, look, there were really 4 types of voters. There were people who liked Trump and Hillary, 0%. Okay? Then there were people that liked Trump, not Hillary, 40. People who liked Hillary, not Trump, 40. And that left over 20% that didn't like either candidate. Forget the other 80%. They're done. Okay? Only people who mattered were the 20% who didn't like either candidate. Now, when you don't like either candidate, how are you going to vote? Now, one theory, and I think this was the Clinton theory, was if we just make them like Trump less, and both of them were at 65% strong negatives. If you just make them like him less, they will vote for us. I think that theory didn't turn out to be right. I think actually, when people don't like both candidates, they've got to vote on something other than the candidates, because they don't like them. So I think they voted primarily on the change and the issue platform of Trump, that they heard trade, immigration, jobs, law and order. And then when you go to people in Michigan and these other places and you ask them why they voted, they don't say, I voted for Trump because I love Trump. They usually give out 2 or 3 of these issues, which unfortunately no one could really do on the other side. So in the most personal campaign that I have ever seen in my lifetime, at the end of the day, I think the decisive 20% actually voted on issues and just called the personality stuff a draw.
I just want to add to Mark. Thank you, Mark, for validating what we saw in the election and what they didn't clearly see in the election. But I think even more to the point, you were talking about what they knew about his issue positions. One of the things that was actually very frustrating to us is when we do qualitative research, and we'd sit in the room and we'd tell the voters, to what Margie was saying, voters really don't pay much attention. This was probably one of the most contentious presidential elections, and even to the end, I mean, we're talking September and October, you have these voters sitting in a room and you'd say to them, this is a candidate's position on trade. Which candidate is it? They couldn't tell you. Which, do you agree with it? Do you disagree with it? Most of them would agree with it. Go through a whole series of them. 8 out of 10 times, they agreed with the Trump position on the issues. But because of what they thought about him personally, it was an impediment to get them to focus on his issue positions.
I think a lot of people would point to the Shorenstein Center's report on the kinds of coverage that people saw over, look.
No, I understand, but I'm saying it had, but even
Overwhelmingly about
before
Clinton's
that,
emails,
even
more
before
about
that,
Trump's policies.
it didn't, even though he talked about trade and stuff like that. I'm not blaming it on the media saying that they didn't report it. They reported it. The voters didn't
When you read it in a poll or
right. They didn't necessarily pay attention to it.
Let's think about the future a little bit.
And I just want to be clear
yeah.
that I did not necessarily validate anything, but it's a very good Republican kind of PR technique. I just want to.
It's called fake news, Mark.
But kind of follow up on Mark's point though about the 20%, which does connect to your point about temperament versus ethics, right? I remember the last postmortem that we had here a few months ago, where Dan Balls was hosting the conversation, moderating the conversation. By the way, there's a book that you can find that has the full transcript, which I think is fascinating read. But talk about the temperament issue. And your critique of the Clinton campaign at that point, which was that they were running a fairly narrow strategy focused on temperament. And then I recall you saying that I think it was through qualitative research, that voters didn't comprehend a time when a President Trump would have his finger on the button. I read through that chapter, the conversation, we talked about Iraq, Iran, Barry Goldwater, and Syria. Didn't hear anything about North Korea in that entire chapter. 6 months later now, I think it's fair to say that we have not expanded the base. These were tactics that worked for an election. But what are voters thinking today about temperament, and how concerned are you that the president needs to expand his base for 2018 and certainly beyond?
There is no question. I mean, you couldn't put together the same group of people who elected Donald J. Trump president just a few months ago exist, but they are not cohesive today. We have seen an erosion in a number of places. The Republican base is still largely intact, but a lot of the independents and the few Democrats that he attracted have really fallen by the wayside. If it's possible, his numbers with those people have actually gotten worse in some places than they've gotten better. And the concerns where they voted, I like to call those voters in some cases nose holders, where they held their nose and they voted, now there are other concerns that have come into play that weren't contemplated then in their minds. Whether it is North Korea, whether it is, you talked about climate change, but the fact of the matter is that I don't know that they actually believed that he would withdraw from, whether he would actually withdraw.
Right.
And because he said so many different things, it was, for a lot of voters. But now you can see clearly that instead of, politics is a game of addition, not of subtraction. And what we have here is we have subtraction that's occurring based on concerns that are being raised directly from the White House as opposed to outside the White House. And so it's going to be very difficult to get back some of those voters. But again, elections are a contest between two people. And depending on who the opponent is will determine, just like it was with Clinton. There's no question that if it had been anybody other than Clinton or anybody other than Trump, that race would have not been as close as it was either way. Would not have been. Meaning if it had been another Democrat.
Trump, what do you think happens with Sanders v. Trump?
I think Sanders beats him.
Margie?
Well, my husband did Sanders television ads, so I will recuse myself from the Sanders question, but he has his own point of view on that.
I think, and I don't know if Mark agrees on that, but I think Sanders would have had the ability to reach a lot of the less than college educated, lower income white voters.
But so I just want to, and
That we did.
we've touched around it a little bit, but I want to make sure we talk about it because it's hard. It's an elephant in the room for me, and certainly looking at all the literature that's come out after the election, and it's also where we go next and how we heal and move on, and that is the role that racial and gender animosity played in this election is just horrifying to me as someone on the left. I felt humbled by how bad it was and continues to be. I mean, that's my and I've sat in focus groups where people have said some strong things, and it's been humbling to see what's happened. And I think when folks talk about and I'm not going to defend or not defend the Clinton strategy, but when folks talk about that, they're talking about her her advertising being narrow, her message being narrow. They're talking about the fact that she, her campaign did spend a lot of time talking about some of the really egregious comments that Trump made about people of color and women and so on. And this is the challenge that we all face. It's a challenge on the right, it's a challenge on the left, which is how do we, talk to people from a variety of different walks of life without making people feel defensive about something they say or believe, but also making other people feel safe and heard and respected. And I don't have there's no easy answer to that, but that is the problem we all need to solve, because what's happening now, you see it in the Virginia advertising in the gubernatorial race, you see it in just the daily traffic back and forth with Trump. It is really troubling, and it doesn't really seem like it's getting any better. But I wanted to make sure we mentioned it because it's such a big part of what happened, and all that. There's so much academic research that shows it's not all Trump voters, but for a portion of Trump voters, that was that really drove them more than we've seen in other Republican contests and for other Republican candidates.
In a moment, I'm going to open up to the audience questions, but first, I want to hear kind of Mark's take on what Democrats should do, specifically, Mark, policies, et cetera, to kind of expand their party and franchise for 18 and beyond.
Well, I mean, I wrote an op-ed that you could read in the New York Times that really said back to the center Democrats. I mean, I spent a lot of time saying that, look, the Democratic center, and what does that mean? In some means, it means taking back the economy issue. It means taking back the trade issue. It means taking back a lot of the issues that Trump in some ways stole from the Democrats. It means also having a politics, I think, that is somewhat more about the future. The kind of life that certainly the people here experience today compared to the life of 50 years ago, you wouldn't actually think that there was a tremendous difference from the way political issues are pretty much still fighting about factory jobs. They're still fighting about trade agreements. They're not talking about the ascendancy of technology, what it will mean, how it's changing society. I've yet to see a presidential candidate that was even semi-comfortable talking about that, since I think Clinton and Gore were probably the most comfortable. Even in those days, we didn't even have cell phones. They were big clunky things like that. If you really imagine it. So I don't think people are seeing the problems. What are the problems of the new kinds of workers and workforces? How will things evolve? And I'll just say that also, I have a little grid where I say, well, look, presidents and leaders today are old economy or new economy, and they're nationalists or internationalists. And I think clearly Obama was a new economy nationalist, and Trump is an internationalist, and that Trump is an old economy nationalist, and that those two dimensions explain probably 90% of the policies and the policy directions, and there are very few leaders in the world, although I'd say Modi in India is an internationalist. He is a nationalist new economy leader. It's very hard to find that combination of leaders, which I think. So my point about Democrats have got to, I think, hold the center so that it puts them in a strong position to regain these voting groups that have wandered. And then I would also just say, as we thought about Trump, that a lot of what I looked at was as the president's pollster, and we had a guiding principle, which is that we always had to be above 50, Because the minute, remember, we were impeached. We didn't just have some independent counsels flying around. Congress voted to throw us out. The entire year was spent on that. And we were impeached, but the goal was always to stay above 50, because when you're below 50, it's to everybody's advantage to kick you. And then you're down at 35. People actually don't remember that George Bush was in the 20s. Mm-hmm. He was 24, 27. He was a totally hated person. He couldn't even go to his own party's convention. Trump is actually 10, 12 points. But there's no concept of the Trump administration of getting above 50. And I think that's a great advantage for Democrats, because Democrats can either move into that space, right? Because when you look at it, actually the Republicans, if you look at the congressional vote, the Republicans won by 1 point of the 127 or 8 million people who voted in the congressional vote. Actually getting across the finish line, as Obama did, I think means holding the line to the center.
Mark, you cite your op-ed from June. Margie wrote an op-ed a couple of months ago about holding the Democrats. So Mark's point is with Trump in the mid 30s or so, that's an opportunity for Democrats. Are they organized? Is there one unifying Democratic message? And if so, what is it?
So I would say a couple things. I would say there's a difference between tone and policy. And if you look at, and Pew's done this, and if you look over the years, and there's other polling about this too, that the parties and the core midpoint of the parties is widening in terms of what makes a Democrat and how liberal a typical Democrat is versus how conservative a typical Republican is. They used to be very close, now they're very far. And obviously that's one of the many problems and challenges we're all facing. So I don't think I would agree that the center is where Democrats can see, ROI, especially when you look at folks on the left being so enthusiastic. That to me, I think, is something that actually we should be really excited about. That Democrats, there's this sort of meme out there that Republicans are divided, Democrats are divided, everybody's, kind of fighting within their own party. Democrats are really fairly unified on a variety of things. One, how they feel about the president, that's pretty unifying. But also how they feel about a lot of progressive issues and economic issues as well. Now, that doesn't mean we shouldn't reach out. Obviously, that is, cold comfort when you are out of power all over the place. So there's more to it than simply that. And that's, I guess, where, in terms of where we all go next, which is, can people have whatever position they have, whether it's super liberal or centrist, and still want to come together with folks on the other side? I mean, I'm progressive. That doesn't stop me from talking or working with Republicans or trying to hear what Republican voters think. That doesn't make me any less progressive. And that's something that I think a lot of candidates and voters should be able to do, but that's not where we are right now, in our sort of culture. There was a Washington Post University of Maryland poll that came out this past weekend that showed that majorities across party lines feel that they don't feel proud of where things are going. They feel things are worse than they've ever been. And, of the people, I think it's around 70% who think things are worse than they've ever been. About half of those feel that this is permanent, that this is the new normal rather than something that's temporary. I mean, these are really pretty horrifying numbers, and you have to really get people to think small rather than big in order to see that optimism. And what I want to see both on the left and right is folks try to figure out some way to, maintain your values, but also find a way to encourage civility at the same time. And where you don't have people who, don't want their kids to marry someone from the other party, which is what, Pew sometimes find, or feel that it's a strain to have a friend who voted for someone of the other party, or not have anyone in your network who's, voted for someone of the other party. So some of these things are not the party's fault. Some of these things are just demographic, sorting and geographic sorting. But we do now have this cultural problem that I don't see any immediate short or medium term way out of. And if that's something that Democrats, and maybe it's about money and politics and reform, maybe that's a way to go, because can be not so partisan, and then everybody's got a common enemy. I don't know I know there'd be, everybody, would dislike someone else's wealthy donor, not their own. I get it. But it is something that I think is a corrosive thread through all of our politics right now.
I would argue that the point that you made about the parties drifting further apart to their polls actually will hinder what you are suggesting, because the likelihood of nominating lightning rods on both sides becomes greater the more extreme the polls are. And once that happens, and you have such great lightning rods, it is just naturally occurring that you have that level of antipathy towards each other, or that the level of antipathy can be created towards each other. And so I don't think I have ever seen, even in terms of Obama, I don't think the antipathy that was on both sides, whether it was Clinton supporters towards Trump or Trump supporters towards Clinton, that same level of antipathy. I mean, yes, Obama voters didn't like Romney, and Romney voters didn't like Obama, but it wasn't that same level of antipathy.
It's a different plane.
Different plane.
We have a question. If you could do three things, I want to add another variable to this. Your name and who you represent, but specifically which program at the IOP you're also here representing.
My name is Teddy Landis. I'm a sophomore at the college, and I'm a member of the Harvard Public Opinion Project,
There you go.
which is the lovely brainchild of John, and there will be some of our members in the front row here. I have a question that's a follow-up to something you said earlier, Ms. Omero. So you were talking about how there's a lot of these identity issues that came up in the 2016 election, and we have to have really difficult conversations about them. So when we look at attitudes towards identity-based issues, and we look at how opinions change about them, what are the biggest factors that cause those changes? Like I remember looking at polls on same-sex marriage, and we can see that attitudes changed very dramatically over a period of time. And then how might the polling that you guys do differ if you're working for an advocacy group that's working on a single issue versus on a campaign?
So those are really good questions. So, I mean, with LGBT rights, one thing that seemed to have been effective is people coming out. And again, people's personal experience being a driver in a way that a national conversation maybe can't have. And as those smaller, local, individual conversations grew, that helped change people's views. If people are making friends with folks of various kinds of backgrounds, that may make this easier, right? But I don't know if that's where we're headed. Because people want to shut off social media because they feel it makes them tense. And that's one of the places where people can engage with their uncle being the sort of the example that people hold, the avatar of someone you disagree with, right? So I don't know how you take that example and fix it. I do know that there's been academic work that shows when you show an ad saying Trump says racist things, it doesn't actually move a lot of people who support him, because they're like, well, I support him. What are you saying about me? And it makes them very defensive. And that's a conversation that folks on the left who want to just say, well, look what he said. We have to acknowledge that that's where voters are, and figure out what else can we do, and talk about shared values and shared goals and things that we have in common as Americans, rather than say, look, aren't you outraged by this? Even if you are outraged by it. So that is a path, but it doesn't, it's not always enough for folks who say, I feel like I'm being bullied, I'm feeling threatened, I feel like I don't belong, I didn't feel that way before. So these are tensions that are complicated, that everybody's still trying to work out, and I don't think we have a real answer. It's going to depend on the person and on the district and on the campaigns and the candidates. So those things matter. As far as doing an issue group versus a campaign, I mean, a lot of the results are, the approach is the same, which is you want to give people good advice. It doesn't really help anybody to say, hey, we did a poll and 100% of people support everything you have to say. That, people may like that you may leave the meeting or the call and everyone's saying, that's great, we had a great high number, but that's a very short-term view that doesn't actually help anybody in the long view.
I think, let me just say that there has been a return to identity politics, and the one hand, as I described those houses, you could see very much that everyone is beginning to accept that as a model of politics. And yet, the most striking poll finding that I've had lately is a very simple question, about whether or not, after you go through this whole poll and everybody hates everybody else and the country's divided and everything's and 70% say it's the wrong direction. I say, do you want the Democrats and Republicans to work together or not? 91% say yes. So there's a certain point here at which I use this analogy that America has become a restaurant that serves only chicken or fish, and most of the consumers want steak. And if it keeps serving chicken and fish, right, it's going to lose a tremendous number of consumers who really want somebody who governs from the center, who's going to bring people together, who can lead America into this century and get it back above identity politics. Because the more we descend into identity politics, it is, as I think Margie pointed out, a two-way street that can be increasingly destructive to our politics.
There are so many misconceptions inside the Republican Party and inside the Republican elites about what Republican voters want. And actually, the Republican establishment is getting a little bit of a lesson. So when President Trump sat down and cut a deal with Nancy Pelosi and Chuck Schumer, the elites went, oh my God, he's cutting a deal. You know what the Republican base did? They went, finally, something's happening. The notion that conservative voters, Republican voters, Christian voters, whatever you want, gun owners, don't want deals cut for the common good. Just moving the ball down the path to them is huge progress. People ask me all the time, do you think that Donald Trump can be successful as president? And I say, if he can cut the right deals on key issues, yes, he can be. And yes, he can get reelected. Because what voters ultimately want is they want that logjam broken in Washington, where you get someone who's not afraid to reach across the aisle and bring the pieces together to get something good done. Not bad, but good, and get something done. And what Mark said about the 91%, I mean, the numbers that you see all the time, even among Republicans, they're willing to compromise on their principles if they think they're getting something done, the right things done.
Thank you, Teddy.
Hi, I'm Jackson. I'm a sophomore at the college. And I was just wondering, Mr. Fabrizio, and anyone else who's willing to answer this question, the national polls had Clinton about 4 points ahead of Trump on election day. And it seems like, I guess, USC and LA Times are the only ones that got it correct.
No, they got it wrong.
They got it wrong.
Yeah. They got the popular vote, right? The USC poll had Trump winning the popular vote, of which he did not.
Okay. Well, I guess just given that so many people got it wrong, was it a question of sampling bias? What ended up being the decider of why so many people got it wrong?
In my experience, one is that most of the national polls, even the media polls, actually got it right. Any poll that had it, within a couple of points with Hillary Clinton leading, got it right because she won the national vote. Where the real problems came is in the individual states. And what I found in our polling on the campaign was that a lot of the media polls were, in fact, weighting their data, expecting the turnout to be like 2008 and 2012, when in fact, in a number of those states, particularly states like Iowa and Pennsylvania and Michigan and Wisconsin, the turnout was different. It was slightly more Republican, it was slightly less minority, it was more hospitable to a Trump vote than it was to a Clinton vote. And that surge, even in states like Florida, we saw it. And that surge obviously helped. And think about this. If you turn 5 counties, count them, we'd be sitting here having a conversation about President Clinton and not President Trump. 4 in Florida, 1 in Michigan, game over. So it's not, yes, the electoral vote margin was large, but the actual vote margin in these states was very small.
If you read the APOR, is an industry organization, they did a big report, what happened, and this is a question that, folks have been asking a lot. You're right to ask it. It's one that people, want to know the answer to, because it makes people worry about whether or not we can trust polling and trust reporting about polling. And a couple things stuck out to me from that report. One is the role of weighting by education in some of the key states, that states and polls that didn't weight by education were off by a larger amount, and if you went back and weighted by education, you'd be a lot closer, in part because it's just hard to reach downscale voters, no matter what kind of methodology you use, online or cell phones and so on. And education was such a big driver of Trump versus Clinton in a lot of states, so that played a role. And then the other thing I would add is, the expectation setting done by having handicappers and the reporting of it, where we just wanted to have the answer before game day. We just wanted to know what the score was, and we would watch these numbers in a way that we never did before, and quite this sort of round the clock watching, and it leads the New York Times to write transition stories and so on. And so that, I think, had people think differently about what they expected, which we may not have if we just had sort of polls on their own that were, ultimately pretty close.
Mark, lessons learned, and how do they apply for next cycle?
I think it was, and I think it's a lesson for the students here. I would say the fault was less in the, quote, polls and more in the lack of analysis of the polls. That, now, I had the advantage when I was working against you. I had polls in 25 states up until the last day. I had national polls. I had a vote projection for each and every state. I understood and told the president on Air Force One coming back that we were going to get 49 instead of 50, because I'd calculated that the Nader vote in California would be larger. That level of analysis, when people now have more access to information, more access to polls, the networks and the campaigns have billions of dollars. Not one person looking back really posted an intelligent memo, not just giving I think so-and-so is going to win, but really giving you an analysis of what they thought were going to be the key variables, how those votes would interact then with the Electoral College, and how that would work its way through. There's not one memo out of there was more, quote, study. And this is why in Microtrends I talk about the impressionable elites. People substitute today, talking points they get from cable TV for what really should have been hundreds of hours of analysis, going through past elections, turnouts, probabilities. So I think the level of analysis is poor, and then I think always seeing the other side's storyline. I think a lot of polls only polled one storyline. I think a lot of polls only poll one storyline now. Look, I said all during the primaries, Trump never getting above 30%, never getting above 40%, never, ever, ever getting above 50%. Now, after I was wrong about that, then you've got to recognize that maybe you need, at that point, to really consider the probabilities and the stories and the messages somewhat differently. And I think the reporting job on that was missed, and I think the in-depth analytical stuff was missed. Instead, people were just looking at the top line.
Thanks, Mark. A final question, and we're going to have 3 quick responses.
Jay Gleason. In a recent Harvard-Harris poll, contained a curious question about Iran, which it stated that some people say that the Iran deal is not perfect, but we should let it slide. Other people say that they're not in compliance and we should renegotiate it. So the question then was, do you favor either renegotiating the deal with Iran, or do you favor just letting it alone as it is? And then later, in commenting on this question, you said that the North Korea and Iran regimes are universally despised by the American public. And I'm just wondering, first of all, that's a very prejudicial question against Iran. It doesn't contain any information that the IEA and European intelligence agencies and many others have verified that Iran is fully compliant with the deal. And secondly of all, how can you say that every single American despises Iran? North Korea may be a different case, but I mean, I don't see the basis for either the question or the.
I think you have to go, the entire poll is posted. So, for example, we have favorable, unfavorables on the leaders of Iran. So there's about 15 questions about Iran. And let me tell you, I think public opinion attitudes about Iran are very complex. And I would say part of what we do in this poll is we post everything, we post all the crosstabs. In that same poll, I think the leaders of Iran have an 88% negative. 66% say that they don't think Iran is complying with the deal. The questions start out neutrally, and then there was this hypothetical, do you think you should let it slide, or do you think you should renegotiate? We're going to put even more questions in. There's 10 or 15 questions in Iran. I would say where public opinion is they don't trust Iran. They don't believe Iran is complying. I think they do favor renegotiating. They're not comfortable with Trump's approach. They're very split about certifying and decertifying, because they're not comfortable whether Trump can actually accomplish what they want. 90% don't want them to have nuclear weapons. They don't have full confidence in Trump to negotiate his way through. They're worried, but they do think Iran is cheating.
Great. And Mark, all of those questions are available with the crosstabs online?
They're all online, every question, every answer. Make your own interpretation.
Great. And as is the work of our terrific students here, all the Harvard Public Opinion Project questions are also online at the IOP website, iop.harvard.edu. On behalf of our students, on the community, I want to thank Mark, Margie, and Tony for tonight's discussion.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you.
Have a great night.